Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. It is amazing to see some faces that I already know and some faces that are new to me. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Roxy Manning, and I'm delighted to be here with you. Especially if you don't know me, and because we are doing this call as part of the kind of information sharing for the Embodying NVC program, I would love to take two questions from anybody who doesn't know me about anything you want to know about me, and then I'll jump into today's presentation. So, what would you like to know about me? And I'll ask you to raise your electronic hand if you have a question so that we can find you more easily. I'm going to pause awkwardly because part of the goal of the program is that you will be incredibly engaged and interactive, which means you get to ask questions. So, waiting to see who has a question, anything you want to know about me. Ah, Bonnie, wow. This is, for those of you who don't know, I think I met Bonnie almost 20 years ago. Wow. Hi,
Yes.
Bonnie.
Hi, Roxy. Good to see you.
You too.
I guess what I want to know about you right now is, how you're feeling about this moment that we're in, which feels scary to parts of me.
Wow. So many of you know that I'm Trinidadian. And depending on where you are in the world, you might not know that Trinidad is 3 miles from Venezuela. And how I'm feeling about this moment is pretty much encapsulated by that fact that I am currently residing in a country with a president who thinks that and spurious wars on people from other countries, from people within this country, from people who don't look like him, who don't think like him, who don't share his values, are okay. And it's terrifying. I think what I'm feeling in this moment is incredibly terrified. And that's part of why I think all of these programs, people who are committed to understanding NVC, and for me, part of what made me say yes to the Embodying NVC program, people who are committed to using NVC for change, not just to like make my family relationships better. And I'm not knocking that, right? That's important. That's how I got into NVC. But people who believe that nonviolent communication can actually create meaningful change in the world, meaningful discourse, offer us meaningful strategies, we need us. And so I feel both a lot of fear about what the next few years will bring and paradoxically some hope. I feel hope when I see my 20-year-old who's out there, still having all of the passion and commitment for change that 20-year-olds have. And then when I look on calls like this and I see the incredible range of people on the call, just like looking at the huge diversity, and imagine that there are people all over the world who are resisting a lot of fascist agendas in many, many parts of the world. Because Lord knows the US is not the only country that's been facing and dealing with this for generations. So, both fear and hope. Thank you. And Sooks.
Hello.
Hello.
Um, so I think I've been thinking a lot about this, and I feel like asking the questions that you're thinking about is kind of the easiest way to understand the world. So I'm wondering when you went from being a student of NVC, and I understand that you'll always be a student of NVC, but when you went from that to being a teacher, what was it that made that switch for you?
I love this question. Thank you. Um, I'm actually blushing as I think about this question because I still remember that journey. I think honestly, what made the switch for me was other people's faith in me. Because when I first learned NVC, I was incredibly shy. I was still at a part of my self journey where I didn't actually believe I had anything to offer anybody for any reason. And so I did a lot of, okay, if I'm going to teach something, I'm going to spend like, I would teach a 45-minute class. It would take me about 6 hours to prepare. And it would be the kind of obsessive, like, I've got to get everything exactly right. Then I need empathy. Then I need to like think about all the ways I'm going to mess it up. Um, I have some dear friends who have been with me for this entire journey, and Mickey and Imbal Kashtan were two of my very first teachers. First was Marshall, then it was Mickey and Imbal. And they were the ones who said, hey, we want you to come and teach with us. We want you to come and work with us. And I said yes. But every time I had to teach, my friends still teased me about this. I would sit at the front of the room next to them, and then I would whisper into their ears whenever I had anything to say, because I couldn't say it to the whole room. And then Mickey would kind of like elbow me and say, just say it already. And that was my journey, right? So my journey was finding first my voice and what it was that I was passionate about, realizing that, especially in some ways because of my identities, that there was a way of thinking and viewing about the world that wasn't being represented in traditional NVC teaching, and that felt important, that my speaking up made it possible for other people who looked like me, who had some of my lived experiences, to see NVC as meaningful for them. And then just having a lot of support from people who kept, holding me whenever I would collapse and say, oh my gosh, I'm so horrible at this, and then push me to go back out there and do it. So that was part of what made that possible for me. And again, like
Thank you
it
so
feels,
much for that. Mm.
you're so welcome. I was going to say it feels a little bit strange because I don't like to do very promo-y kind of things, but it's also part of why I love Martha. Martha was actually Martha Lashley, who was one of the people who conceptualized this program. She was one of my first teachers in that very first year. And like also watching people who I saw on that journey kind of stepping up and saying, I'm going to be this, like Martha is huge, huge admiration for her. She's a person who will always say things exactly as they are, and got into so many conflicts with the facilitators as an assistant. And I would sit there and watch that and go, oh, whoa, that's possible? You can have conflict and still be on a team and be accepted? And so when she said, let's do this program and get more people into teaching and leadership, I was all in. Okay, so that was two questions to know a little bit about me. Let me jump into today's content because I imagine that's why many of you came. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and Kunal, who brains behind the program, is going to share with you also a PDF of the slide so that you can follow along or watch my screen as you'd like, and definitely so that you can see the information after. And here we are. And I'm just getting my screen back into the setup that I prefer. Okay, so what I wanted to talk with you all about today, and I know it's a really brief conversation and we're going to go a lot more into it later, is around what does it mean to use NVC, and especially when you're an NVC trainer, to share NVC in group settings in a way that really support equitable spaces. And what I'm going to talk about is first I'm going to explore a brief framework, one that I got from Mickey, and then we're going to do a little bit of practicing on noticing some of the elements of this framework, being able to see some of these equity dynamics as they unfold. We're going to get a 3-step tool for interrupting when you notice something that's happening that's not contributing to the kind of equity that you want in the room. And then we'll talk a little bit about the program and answer any questions you have about the program. So I'd like to start off by hearing from a couple of y'all, just share a few responses in the chat. When you're in a group, maybe you're in the group as a participant or as a facilitator, what makes it hard to make sure that everyone's voice and perspective is included? What are some things you notice that make that difficult? So,
I can share.
great.
For me, it's difficult when there's some or a few people who take up a lot of space and are constantly speaking their opinions or sharing in every moment that's possible. It's hard to also have the others included who are more introvert or a bit more hesitant to show up and to
Mm.
include them.
I love this because you've named a couple of things, right? One of them is when there's certain voices that are prioritizing most of the airtime, most of the conversation that's happening in the space. And then the other piece that you alluded to is not just that there's certain voices, but when there's certain voices are prioritized based on certain characteristics about those voices. So maybe the people who are more extroverted, who find it easier to speak, have an easier time, an easier entry into the conversation than those who are more introverted, right? And it could also be those who speak a different language, those who, maybe process information differently and need more space to be able to bring their voice forward. Absolutely. And
Yes,
that's either.
and
Mhm.
there's another hint to it as well, because those who are speaking up and who are more extrovert and bringing their voices in that much, um, well, in my effort to include the rest, I would easily block these and then in that way not have them included, the ones that
Mhm.
do speak up.
So one of the challenges when we're trying to create these equitable spaces is how do we make sure that we hold strategies that bring everyone's voices in and don't suppress anyone's voices, right? Because sometimes I know as a facilitator, I can be like, oh my gosh, I've heard from this person 20 times. And then they actually might have something important to say, but because I'm now like, I don't want to hear from them, I'm not actually really attending to the needs in the moment. Great. Okay, and I see several people said someone who is hard to interrupt, someone who's taking up a lot of space. A couple of other things people have said. The urgency of time, right? And language barriers, absolutely. Self-censoring, noticing people's own patterns with, oh, it takes me a while to be able to bring my voice into the space. Oh, I love this one. When I see people and I want to bring their voice into the room, but I also want to honor their choice. What if they're choosing? It's not that there's an equity issue, but they're like, I don't have anything to say. I don't want to speak. Why are you calling on me just because you think I'm from a group that's hard to speak, has a hard time speaking, right? Absolutely. Okay. So those are some examples of some of the challenges that we might find when we're trying to make sure that everyone's voice is included. So, why is it important to think about equity issues when we are facilitating? Well, one of the big things that we realized is that a lot of facilitators, and that facilitator that I was long ago was absolutely one of these people. I was so focused on what is it that I have to teach? What is the content that I have to deliver? That I often was only paying attention to that. Did I get my point across? Did I say what I needed to say? And what I wasn't paying attention to are what are the power dynamics in the room? What are the relationships that are happening in the room? And how does that impact how what I'm trying to deliver is being received, right? I can have beautiful content, but if there's a lot of tension in the room, nobody's taking it in. So this focus on content over dynamics is one of the big challenges for many of us. Another acknowledgement that I like to make is that quiet harm happens. So as a facilitator, I'm teaching, things seem to be going well. I can often focus on the few people who are nodding. Even now I'm looking at you all on the screen and I see some nods and I notice where's my attention drawn. And because I'm only focusing on those quiet nods, I'm not noticing the people who might have been impacted by something that happened in the room, people who might have been impacted by a comment that was made, or somebody who was silenced in a way that others are deeming as harsh, right? And so harm is happening, harm that's impacting the cohesiveness of the group, and again, people's ability to trust and buy into the material without me even noticing. Quiet harm. The other reason that it's really important to notice who's in the room, what's happening in the room, is that I don't want to reinforce the patterns of inequity that exist. And that happens very subtly. When I call on the people or I let those people who are really eager to jump in dominate the conversation, I am reinforcing messages about, and very often unconscious messages about whose voice matters, who has wisdom, who should be the people who are called upon and spoken and acknowledged in the room. And I don't want to do that if I'm a facilitator, right? Part of what we do with nonviolent communication is we're really focusing on all needs mattering. That also means all people mattering. If I reinforce those old patterns, I'm actually giving a counter message to what's important and precious to me about nonviolent communication. So what's really important is that I really work and I hold an intention to create equitable spaces. Spaces where I'm looking at not just the content of what's being shared, but what's happening below the surface, the things that make it possible to absorb and take in the explicit and implicit messages of what I'm trying to deliver. Any questions about this so far? Okay, so this framework that I'm going to present is really based on the work of Mickey Kasha. Mickey is one of my dear, dear teachers and friends. And one of the things that Mickey and I have talked about a lot is that in order to be efficient at being able to create equitable spaces, it's really important to notice and track what's happening in the room. So as a facilitator, yes, I'm tracking my content. Am I making all of my points? Am I getting through my agenda? But what I'm also doing is I'm tracking some of these dynamics that are taking place. So these are the 5 important things to track. And I'm going to go into each of them in some depth. And Kunal, there's a request for the PowerPoint in the chat. Can you put it in the chat again for anyone who joined late? Thank you. I'm going to track people, needs, resources, purpose, and impact. And let's look at each of these. When I'm tracking people, what I'm trying to track is which voices are heard. We want to notice who is speaking most frequently and who's staying silent, right? And when we look at that, we're not just noticing who, but it's also important to me to notice, are there patterns in who's staying silent and who's speaking? And some of the common patterns that we can often find are we hearing the male voices more than female voices, or voices of those who are non-binary or trans? Are we noticing patterns around ethnicity, race, gender, age, and status in the group? And status is something that we often don't think about, right? When we start thinking about equity pieces, we're often looking at some of these more visible identities, but we're not looking at things like who has structural power in the room and who has rank that might be related to things like age, might be related to things like if I'm an elder in my community, if I'm the person who's the CEO in the community, if I'm a person who has moral authority in the community, right? Everyone thinks, oh, this person has wisdom because they survived a certain experience, and therefore they're the person that we should listen to opposed to anyone else. Conversely, some of the things that we can look at are not who's only taking up space, but who gets interrupted. I was on a call just recently with an organization that wanted to hire me to do equity work. And the call had 3 people, 2 women, including 1 woman of color, and the CEO who was a white male. And the CEO asked the woman to talk about what are some of the equity challenges that the organization was facing. And one of the patterns that I noticed, and I pointed out in this call as they were trying to hire me, was whenever the woman spoke, especially the woman of color, the CEO would interrupt to tell about his perspective, right? In a call where they're talking about equity. So this pattern of like who's interrupted, and the woman never interrupted the CEO, was really glaringly obvious and not something that they were noticing and paying attention to. And when we do that, we're sending messages, right? We're sending messages about whose opinion is valued, whose time is important, and whose opinion is not as important, not as worthy, and easily discounted. So it's really important to acknowledge that attention doesn't equal merit. And that when we look at just speaking patterns, we often think that who we're giving attention to is a signal of merit. And we want to make sure that we pay attention to not just who's taking up the space, but also who is not getting the space. And who's getting that space is not at all an indicator of who has value, even though that's often what we equate in our actions. So I want to actually give you all an example of what this might look like. In a group where you're facilitating, and this program, Embodying NVC, is for people who are brand new to NVC, but also for people who are wanting to step into facilitation. So in a group that you're facilitating, you might notice that there are 3 white participants who've spoken multiple times, and every time they speak, it's like they're ping-ponging off each other's ideas, right? And a global majority participant in the group has raised their hand several times, but hasn't yet been called on, right? There are a number of reasons why that might happen when we're tracking people. It could just be that whatever it is that the white participants are speaking about is actually building on each other. We want to pay attention to and follow content and flow, but we also want to notice when that is at the expense of whose voice is being included. And so noticing some of these patterns are really important. And we'll talk about some ways to interrupt them when they happen. Quick pause to see if there are any questions about tracking people. And Unya. And Unya, I just want to point out, you're very lucky that you're on my screen because I think half the group isn't. So I saw you raise your physical hand, but I just want to remind folks to raise their electronic hand if they can. You can often find it by clicking more or reactions on your screen or clicking the 3 dots by your face. Unya.
Thank you. Thank you. I forgot how to do that. So I was kind of trying to find that electronic hand in the moment. I just wanted to, I find it very difficult in the virtual room on the point about body language. Any tips on that? Because you're working with just facial expression. And as you said, sometimes you're not even seeing the person. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah. And there are some ways that some strategies you can do to bring in more voices. So even if I can't see everyone, I can often ask people to put things into the chat. I can do things that are putting people in groups that help to make sure that there's engagement happening with everyone. So we can go into that a lot in other courses. But one of this, like even right now, I'm imagining that many of you have your screen on speaker view, right? So that you can see me, you can see the slides. My screen is actually primarily on gallery view. So I'm able to see 18 people right now, and I will switch between the different screens randomly so that I can look at people's body language, look at people's faces as I'm teaching. So that's one of my tips when I'm teaching on Zoom, is to just, as a facilitator, to keep rotating through the different screens. Don't like pick the screens, find the people I like, and then stay there. Or don't keep my PowerPoint really big. My PowerPoint is actually pretty minimized, and your faces are what's really big so that I can track what's happening in the room. Thank you for that. Okay. It also helps, and this is hard. Those of you who've ever seen me teach when I'm traveling, when I'm not on my big screen, it's really hard because then I'm trying to do this on a tiny laptop screen. So I just want to acknowledge that as well. Okay, the next thing we might track are needs. And needs, this is thinking about nonviolent communication needs. What are the needs that are in the room? And we can notice needs both from behavior, both from like expressions of confusion in the room. When I see somebody looking confused, then I kind of start guessing what are the needs that are not being met in the moment, right? I can make some guesses about needs based on the questions that are being asked, based on any like explicit expressions of resistance to the content that I'm offering or to what's happening in the space. There are lots of different ways that we can track needs and to make guesses about the needs that are happening. And when we're making those guesses, then we often want to check in to see if our guesses are accurate, right? Then the other way that we can track needs is to notice not just what are the needs that are in the room, but also whose needs are being met and whose needs are not being met. So it's another version of combining tracking people, but also by tracking the needs that are in the room. So if one of the needs that people often meet are my needs for clarity and my needs for understanding, my needs for expression. That often I can be looking at just tracking people by saying who's speaking, who's not speaking, but I can also look at what are the needs that people are getting met when they speak and whose needs, with those needs, which people are getting those needs met. So if people are often asking questions, but the only people who are asking questions are folks who are from the global north or folks who are fluent in English, then I'm tracking a couple of different sets of needs. That needs for understanding might not be met for a certain subset of my group. When there are a lot of unmet needs in the group, there's going to be tension. When there are unmet needs for a specific subset of the group, there's another level of tension that's happening in the group, and there's more harm that's happening. That quiet harm starts to build. And so I want to pay attention to that and then attend to it when I can. And here's an example of what that might look like. So, and this is one that comes up a lot. A group is planning to meet to have a practice session, right? My very first NVC experiences when I was early in my career was leading an NVC practice group. And the group, our intention was we are going to meet to practice NVC. And what would often happen was somebody completely brand new would join the group, and they would have a ton of questions about really foundational concepts that in some ways the rest of the group had already explored in earlier sessions. And at the beginning, I would spend a lot of time thinking, I've got to get this person on board. I've got to teach them all of these concepts, right? What did that mean? It means that the group's needs for practice, for learning, wasn't being met because one person's needs for understanding was being prioritized. So in terms of tracking and paying attention to needs, I was prioritizing one person's needs over the group's needs. And so this is where, as I got a little bit more skilled in this, being able to track needs and think whose needs am I meeting helped me to start to come up with different strategies for attending to that. So let me ask a quick question of all of y'all. What is a strategy that you might do to attend to the group's needs in that situation that I just described? Anybody, you can put it into the chat or somebody can say it out loud. How would you attend to the group's needs in that situation? Anthony.
Yeah, I probably would not allow people to come into the group midway.
Mm-hmm.
So if those who joined in the group in the beginning, once you get in, you don't make the first session, that's
Mm-hmm.
it. That's probably
Absolutely.
what I would put.
So that is absolutely one strategy. And I'm going to come back to that when we get to another thing to track. But one strategy is to say, hey, we need everyone to be on the same page because that will reduce, somebody having some pretty important needs unmet. If that person doesn't understand, they can't join the group. And let us all be on the same page. And then some others that I saw in the chat, right? Definitely, you can explicitly ask that person, hey, I get that you don't understand this concept. Here's some work you can do offline, but we're going to continue with this so that we can attend to all of the group's needs. I love some of the options that folks are putting into the chat, which is as I attend to which needs I'm prioritizing, maybe there's a reason that I want to prioritize this individual's needs. But if I do that, I want to explicitly state why I'm doing that as a way of bringing the whole group along. And so that they also have at minimum their needs for inclusion and care for their needs attended to, even if I'm not fully attended to their need for practice in that moment. Great. And then some other things in the chat, beautiful, breaking into small groups to practice. Absolutely. So y'all have some ideas that once we start tracking these things, there are strategies we can take to attend to them. Okay, something else that we might track. Purpose. This is a huge one, and this is kind of related to what I was just talking about. Purpose is the anchor for why your group is meeting. Every single time a group gets together, you're there for a reason. And if you just kind of ran into each other, let's say you're at the subway waiting for something and a whole bunch of people started chatting, that's happened. I'm one of those people who will start chatting to random strangers, and if it's a long wait, I'll start a whole conversation with people, right? But there's still a purpose. There's still a reason why y'all are talking. And so being clear on your purpose and then tracking everything that happens in that group to is it actually supporting the outcome that we're moving towards, that we're there for? Are we attending to the relationships? Because the relationships in the group is another purpose that's often not attended to. There are two purposes every time the group comes together. When I'm thinking as an NVC facilitator, there's purpose around the content, learning, or process that I want to bring to the group. But there's also, for me, always purpose around how can I create a community that gets a lived experience of being in the NVC community. That's attending to the relationships in the group. So I want to make sure that you get the content I want to teach, whatever that purpose is, and that you get an experience of we are an NVC community, we're an NVC learning community. And so then as a tracker, I'm always assessing, is what I'm doing aligned to either of these purposes? And if it's not, I want to course correct. You will find me when I'm teaching in the middle of something, like if I started talking with a participant, we got a little bit off tangent, I will say, actually, I want to pause for a moment because this is a great conversation, there's great learning, but it's actually a little bit off topic to the main purpose that brought us here together, and I will course correct and go back to our purpose. In that last example that we gave, if the group's purpose was practice, it's really easy to say, hey, I get that there's some really important foundational pieces that are missing for you, but our purpose today was to practice giving empathy. And so I'd love you to just watch it so that I could really support everyone's ability to stay aligned with our purpose in this moment, right? So I can help the person understand why I'm not willing to further attend to their needs by bringing it back to I'm holding purpose for everyone. So purpose is always going to be your guiding star when you're teaching. Okay, another big piece is resources. Resources can take two forms. First, you can track the internal resources in the room. Who has what internal resources that would allow them to participate fully in the group? And some of those internal resources can be things like internal capacity, emotional regulation. If I'm teaching a class, I remember that I was doing a group. I think there were about 500 people on this Zoom call. It was for a community college here in California where I live. And at this call, it just so happened that this call was taking place, I think, within the week of George Floyd dying. For those of you who are not from the US, George Floyd was the African-American man who was murdered by the police. And I was very aware that quite a number of people in the room who were global majority were very likely incredibly impacted by that. I also imagine that there were a lot of white participants who were also deeply impacted by what happened. But part of what I was tracking was that there were a number of folks who would not have the emotional capacity to be present for anything that I was teaching. And so that was a resource that some people would not have in that moment to allow them to participate in the class. So tracking who has what resources would allow me to change what I was doing in the room to then resource everyone. And so we did. We spent the first 10 minutes of this call that was, an organizational training, assessing what were the resource needs in the room. And then we spent another 20 minutes putting people in breakout groups so that they could process some of what they were feeling. Because it was clear that that resource needed to be built for us to be able to do any of the content that I was going to bring. And so tracking resource, even for something like dysregulation, a lot of us are like, oh my gosh, go take that offline, deal with it offline. That might very much disenfranchise people and disenfranchise them reliably along different forms of identity. So tracking that is really important. Other things to track are language. In an international program, I need to be aware, how quickly am I speaking? That's always one of my challenges. But also, do we have capacity like some external resources, like other transcriptions available? Are materials being translated? How familiar are people in the group with the dominant culture of the facilitator, and how familiar are they with each other's cultures, right? That's an internal resource that could then make it hard for some people to raise their hands and participate, for some people to choose not to participate. So there are a lot of ways that these internal resources might impact people's capacity to teach, to be present. Another one that I always like to speak to, because it's one that comes up so often when I teach, Right now, we're on a Zoom call, right? And I'm teaching in this very lecture style format. For a lot of people, and especially people who come from power down identities, this setting is incredibly triggering because they have had incredibly painful experiences with formal education. They've had experiences in formal education where whenever they've raised their hands, they've either been mocked, humiliated, they've been essentially told that their voice didn't matter, or they didn't have familiarity with some of the structures in the classroom. And so then when they try to engage, they couldn't find a way to do that. And so when people have had challenges with formal education, this kind of setting can very much impact their ability, their confidence in bringing their voices forward. So I want to pay attention to that. That's an internal resource that could very much impact, again, who I'm tracking in terms of people and whose needs are being met in the room. It's very interesting to notice how these all intersect, right? Some of the external resources that we might track are some things that we can control. So what kind of technology needs might we have that are impacting people's ability to participate? When Unya raised her physical hand, I said, hey, here's how you would raise your electronic hand as a way of acknowledging that not everyone would have familiarity or remember the technology steps to be able to access including their voice into space, right? So that's an easy step we can take to give everyone the resource that supports participation. I want to go back to the comment that Anthony made, when Anthony said, well, I wouldn't let people join the class late. Well, sometimes someone joining late might be a resource question, right? Somebody might need to join late because, you know what, the class is meeting on a religious holiday and the first class was on a holiday that's very important to my community, and I could not in integrity miss that holiday, miss honoring that holiday. So now that's a resource that somebody couldn't participate in. My saying you absolutely can't join immediately takes people out of that possibility of joining the class. So absolutely okay to say you can join late, but it's important to track what does that mean for who's included, who's not included, right? So I love that you brought that piece, Anthony. Really important thing to notice when we think about resources is that when you come from a marginalized group or a group that doesn't have access to the resources of most of the people in the call, you often have to work a lot harder in order to be able to participate. You might have to work a lot harder financially to join the class. I am so aware that for some programs, the financial cost for some people to join is about, a year's salary, 2-year salary for some folks. And then for other folks, it's like a day's salary, right? Think about what that means for somebody saying, I'm going to join a certain program or not. So then the amount of effort and work it takes for someone to join a program means that there's not already a level playing field. I might be joining the class feeling exhausted because I've taken on extra work to be able to afford the class, right? Then I'm not going to have the energy, the emotional resources to be able to participate as fully as someone else who has lots of space and time and energy. So we want to make sure that we're attending to all of that. Absolutely. People with babies and families can't join on time or might be very distracted if they're joining. Okay. And then the last thing that we'll track is impact. Who's affected in the moment? So when something happens in the room, it is having an impact, and that impact can be huge for some people and less for others. I did an IIT just in September, right? And at this IIT, there was a trainer from the Global Majority, and at the very, very first teaching session, the very first full morning, a white participant stood up and started yelling at this participant, used profane language, and started walking around the room mocking his body language. Very, very first session. Now, there was impact for everyone in the room. And then we did an impact circle after that evening when this happened to talk about what had happened. And even though a lot of people expressed shock and kind of confusion about what was happening, one of the reliable patterns of impact that we heard were Global Majority participants who were new to NVC saying, I thought, wow, if this could happen to that trainer who looks like me, then this is not a space for me. I don't belong here. I'm never safe. I will never be able to teach in these spaces. So we were having differential levels of impact, right? Everyone had some impact, but for some people, like one participant who, at a huge expense from a country in the global south, had come to the retreat, said, I thought about going home because I thought this is not a safe space for me, right? So the impact can be incredibly different from something that happens in the room, and we need to be able to track that. Notice some of the patterns that are present in the room, some of the identities that are in the room, and make some assumptions about why that impact might be different. We might need to check out, the impact might not be exactly what we think it is. That's why we want to check out the impact. We want to create space to look at impact, but we definitely need to consider it when we look at it. So I'm going to not give some of the examples. You'll get to play with them when you look at the slides, because I want to talk about the next pieces and make sure that I leave time to talk about the program. So yes, we won't do the micro practice just in order to, I want to make sure I talk to you about the 3 steps on how to intervene. So how do you interrupt when you notice an equity challenge in the space? The first thing is you want to name the observation, and I'll talk very briefly in a second about what that might look like. But you want to name what you're noticing. And you want to name it by noticing both the external observable terms. What is the thing that's happening? What is the thing that was said or done that everybody can say, oh, yes, I saw that happening. But you also want to notice those systemic patterns. So it's noticing, I noticed that the 5 people who've spoken so far, who've raised their hand, are people from the global north, right? And so I'm naming certain people are raising their hands, but I'm also naming a pattern. I'm naming the things that we're often reluctant to say. And there are people from the global north. There are people who might have had more access to this form of learning. I'm trying to use language that's not blaming. I'm not saying, I'm noticing that, once again, some people are taking up all the space in the room, right? That's going to tend to shut down dialogue. But I will say, I'm noticing that these folks are the ones who've spoken, and it's people from this group. I'm not shying away from naming that. I'm also going to share my need. What are the needs that I'm hoping to meet when I'm naming this pattern? It's important for me to be sure that everyone has what they need to be able to contribute in the class, that everyone's voice is heard. So I'm making sure that the need is there, and I'm also tying it to the group's needs. And that's important to me because this is a practice space, and if everyone doesn't speak, then not everyone is getting the same practice opportunities as everyone else. So I'm tying it back to our group's needs and purpose. And then I'm making a request, and I want the request to be very specific and doable. So right now, I'd like the next 5 people to speak to be people who are not from the global north, right? That can be a very specific request that then is very much attending. And this is really important. It has to attend to and directly address the needs that I've just identified, okay? Notice when I'm doing this, that there are a couple of very subtle moves that are hidden in there. I'm not opening this up for debate and dialogue, right? Because that's one of the ways that can pull us away from purpose. If the class is not about talking about equity, if we get into a whole debate about, well, was it really the people from the global north, and is the strategy effective? We're not practicing, right? So we're not attending to purpose. And all of a sudden, everything's derailed. So you need to be really affirmed in your stance as a facilitator and make moves that might not make everyone happy, but you are clear and you're naming how they attend to purpose. Right? So 3 steps: name the observation, share your need, connecting it to your need and the group needs, and then make a very explicit request. I'll briefly say a little bit about making observations, and I'll talk a lot about this in the program, but when you make observations, there are 3 levels of observations that I always want people to attend to. The first is, what's the stimulus that's happening in the space? What are you seeing or noticing that you can point out to other people? That's the external observation. An internal observation is in some ways tracking yourself in this moment. As a facilitator, what's happening inside of you? What's being triggered? What memories, thoughts, patterns are you noticing that's inside of you? Other people might not see this, but as a facilitator, I might be noticing, oh, wow, I noticed that that person of color hasn't been called on in quite a while, and I'm getting really angry at the white folks who are not also tracking other people in the room who I'm judging are taking up space. If I'm aware of these stories inside of myself, that's going to make sure that I think, okay, take a breath, ground myself so that when I name this to the group, I'm naming it from a self-connected place, not from that place of trigger that's going to make it hard for people to hear my message, right? So there's work that I can do at my own internal observation level. I'll say some more about this later on in the program. And then the third level is what I'd call the systemic observation, naming the patterns. What are you connecting? Whatever happened in the room, what patterns are you connected it to? Patterns around who has access to resources, who has power in society, etc. So this model, I'm just kind of throwing it out there. You'll learn more about it in the program, but this is a really helpful model as you want to name what's happening in the space. Okay, and we're not going to work on the example right now, but you'll get to look at it in the chat. So, crafting your interruption, these are the things that you'll do. You're going to track the inequity, notice what you're tracking, where's inequity happening, who is impacted, right? So before you ever open your mouth, this is what you're tracking. Come up with your observation. Make it really clear, make sure you include the external and systemic levels. Make sure that you connect it to the needs. What are your needs that you're connected to? What are the needs that other people might have? And what are the needs of the group? Then you're going to identify the resources. What are the resources that are available and who has access to those resources? And that will then help you craft the requests that you want to make of the group. So this is another framework to think about that can help you to interrupt and pay attention to equity in your groups. So that was a lot. I know that we don't have a ton of time. A 1 hour call is always like, oh my gosh, how do I balance purpose, right? What it is that I said I'm going to teach in this time. And also my other purpose, which is to talk about the program and connection with y'all. So first, I'd love to get a sense, how many people, thumbs up, some sign of shaking, waving, anything you want to do, that this was important, that you learned something in this past hour? Yeah? Ah, yum. Yay, yay, yay. Wonderful. And I think what I'm going to do now is then talk about a little bit about the program, but also open it up to any kind of questions. It could be questions about anything I've shared and questions about the program for the next 15 minutes. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see all of you and you can all see each other. So this class, this little teaser, is part of our Embodying NVC program that I am excited to be offering. Martha is the person who came to me and said, Roxy, would you do this program? And like I said, Martha was one of my first teachers, and so I'm always amazed at what she has built in the world. And she has been doing it. I know that a lot of the behind the scenes work has been with Anisha and Kunal, who've been kind of doing all of the backbones of making the program come to life. But we're going to be teaching it with Anisha, Yuri, and Kathleen, who is on the call. I didn't see if Anisha or Yuri on the call, but I definitely saw Kathleen's face. And the program is going to be a program that's spanning long time, 9-month weekly classes. And our job is to support people who are new to NVC in learning NVC, but not just learning it, but actually embodying it, right? Getting a lot of practice, getting a lot of feedback so that NVC becomes not just this kind of intellectual concept, but something that you're learning to live through the connections that you have with people, through the feedback and interactions you're having with people. And that it also supports people who want to be facilitators, people who are thinking, okay, I'm watching what Roxy, Kathleen, Yuri, and Anisha are doing, and now I get invited to go and do that in my own community, in my own groups, practice it, and then come back and get feedback on what I do. And one of the, a lot of us are hearing a lot about AI, and, rightly so, we have a lot of worries and fears about AI. But Martha's brilliant idea was, how can we leverage AI and kind of use it for good? And I often talk about NVC for good, NVC for evil. So how can we use AI for good so that we can kind of get the granular, fine-tuned feedback that looks at I know that sometimes as an assessor, I'm an assessor for NVC, I get a lot of transcripts and tapes of people's work, and I'm like listening to it at 2 times speed, which means I'm going to skip something, right? I'm looking for the big picture things. AI can look at what you're giving us at every single minute detail. And we've been training the AI to actually look at it and look for certain patterns so that you'll get a lot of feedback on every single thing you do in the class. So we're using AI to kind of supplement the feedback that we will give you on how you're working in the program. So it's a program that's combining live feedback from your peers, live feedback from the facilitators, and AI augmented feedback to really support you in noticing, tracking, and embodying NVC. And because it's a weekly curriculum, you get to go deep into everything, not just what I brought. Like imagine me taking each of these concepts and expanding them, but into pretty much all of the topics of NVC that people cover: mediation, empathy, self-empathy, transforming enemy images, anything you can imagine. So that's a quick overview of the program. And I want to check if Kunal and Kathleen, and is anyone else on the call from the program that I'm just not seeing because I'm not looking at all of you on my screen. But if any of you have anything to add before we take questions.
I have nothing to it. It was wonderful the way you described Roxy. I am very excited about the AI part of it. We are naming it NVC Whisperer. The idea is to leverage the best possible technology available to us and make good use of it for learning and sharing NVC. And we are trying to give it a different flavor. How would AI behave if we put in a mediation recording or a feedback recording or peer-to-peer learning? So it would have different, I would say, segments, and yeah, it's gonna be wonderful to see what comes up and how people embrace it. So this is the part I'm really looking forward to. Thank you.
Kunal. So what questions do y'all have about the program, about anything? And I will stay on a few minutes later because I talked a little bit longer than I wanted to with the presentation, and I want to make sure I answer your questions. So any questions at all? When does the program begin? Kunal, I'm going to turn to you because I'm so bad with dates. It's in February, but I'm really, really bad with exact dates.
It begins on 5th Feb. It's a weekly program. It begins on 5th Feb. It's a 9-month program. And we are hoping to offer it on 2 time zones. One is US time zone, and then probably one Asia time zone, depending on how many Asian participants turn up.
And then, okay, I'll come back to that one. Someone said, the cost. And Kunal, again, I'll come back to you. Can you see that Kunal is the brains behind the program?
Yeah. So we have sliding scale. You can choose your rate. The standard rate for the program is $2,495, and you can pay more to support others. You can pay reduced price if you have limited resources, and we also have a special class for it where people who want to replicate the program in their own languages, in their own regions, that is also a possibility. So please go and check out our website. All the details are there.
Lovely. And yes, if you receive my newsletter, there's already a link to it in my newsletter, and there will be a link in my newsletter every month. You can also, Kunal, can you put into the chat the link to the website as well, if you're willing, please? Okay,
Yes.
other questions? There was a question, note of appreciation for the slides and the way of speaking. Great. I also want to just name, I experimented with AI to create the slides. So you're going to learn all of these tricks as well on how we can actually use AI to support rather than hurt us. I gave it my notes and said, make me slides, and it did. Replicate means, someone asked, replicate means accept English. Can you unmute and say a little bit more about what you mean by that question? I'm not clear.
Yeah, because when I read it, it was in your own language when you want to replicate. So I was
Mhm.
not sure which language you are meaning, or
Mhm.
all the languages are included.
Yeah, I believe the program will be in English, but if you're a facilitator and you want to share it in your community, you're very much invited to like teach it in your language in your community. And then it will be harder for us to look at some of your transcripts or recordings. And this is one of the things where AI can actually be helpful, right? And let's see, someone else said, and if you have a question and you want to raise a physical, electronic hand, please feel free to do that. But I'm scrolling through the chat. Someone said, I've noticed that in certain rooms, sometimes it's not always identities we expect to take up more space. E.g., women of color doing the woman's planning, which might make naming the inequity a bit more delicate. And there are also passionate, loud rooms where it might be hard to make this type of request. I wonder how to manage this type of situation. So yes, this is one of the huge, almost like leveling it up, the difficulty, right? Because I have been in spaces where, especially when I begin to start paying attention to equity issues, people who have traditionally been silenced are like, oh my gosh, I finally have a place to bring my voice. And all of a sudden, they take up a lot of room. And this is where we're tracking again, not just people, right? But we're also tracking purpose, we're tracking needs, we're tracking all of the other things. So when I intervene, I will still interrupt those people. Like I often find myself giving them a little bit more space because I'm wanting to reinforce the message that yes, your voice is welcome. And then I will start to bring it back to purpose. We've now spent 5 minutes on this, and it's important, and I'm concerned that it's taking us away from this piece that I wanted to make sure we bring. So I'm going to stop here and go to this purpose, right? So I'm acknowledging it, I'm welcoming, and I'm still, because I'm tracking not just people, I'm able to then find a way to gracefully bring it back to the thing that I'm wanting to do. And again, there's so much more we can say about this. Patricia.
Hi, thank you. I'm just feeling the urge to share that just because it's my path right now. In regarding to the interruptions in the chat room,
Mhm.
I'm Brazilian, so if you have ever sat at a Brazilian table, we all talk at the same time, we talk over each other, we're loud, we're intense, we're alive. We interrupt and we don't think that that's rude. So for me, living in the United States has been a learning curve to really tame that part of me, which is aggravating and also a part that I grow. So it's two parts that are coexisting. So I guess what I would like to share, I'm having the urge to share just as a representation of my own culture, is that recently I saw a very interesting analysis by a professor about how culture just share their participation in different way, and that doesn't mean they are trying to be rude or trying to take more space. So I guess my invitation is for the curiosity about where is the person's coming from, because there's three cultures, as my understand, more than that, but she put it that way, which is the Latin. I'm not going to define all the countries, and the ping pong one, and the one that gives you more space in between conversations.
Mhm.
One that gives them more space in between conversations end up getting lost in the game because the intense Latin, like me, can go and respond too quickly and things like that. So I just sharing that because as my growth path,
Mhm.
I carry the gold and the pain of being who I am in the environment that I am. So I'm just
Absolutely. I feel a
inviting
lot of resonance
curiosity
with
of
what
where
you're
we're from.
I feel a lot of
Thank you
resonance
for
with what you're
hearing me.
saying because I'm also from a very similar culture, right? And so this kind of goes back then to the framework that when we start, for me, what you're talking about is a resource question. And it's the resource which I'm hearing you are growing in yourself of how do I become aware of my cultural communication styles and do I have the additional resource of being able to modify it to match whatever the communication style is of the group I'm in? But it's also a resource for the group. And I imagine that this is where you felt pain, that the group can also grow the resource of being more accepting and willing to flow with communicational styles that are not part of their dominant culture, to have either at minimum more tolerance and awareness and acceptance, and possibly even ways of being able to flow with that. And so part of our challenge is, how do we hold and balance both of these? And as a facilitator, I want to be aware of that. So thank you for naming that. Let's see, other questions. I'm scrolling down. Okay, a lot of folks. Oh yeah, so, and I'm loving, Patricia, if you haven't seen in the chat, lots of resonance, not just from people from the Brazilian or the Caribbean, but Greek. Yeah, lots of folks are having this experience. Wonderful. Okay, my dears. I am not seeing any other questions, even though I've offered to make sure I stay to answer any of them. Okay, so what I'll say is I really hope to see some of you in the program, because I think it will be an amazing program and you will be the inaugural class. So what joy. And I look forward to meeting you again in the future. Kunal, anything else we want to share with folks before we close? Can we pay in installments? My guess is yes, but Kunal can be the final word on that.
Yes, we can pay in the installments.
Okay. Thank you, my dears. It was lovely to be with you.